Good morning. The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Counterterrorism and Intelligence will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony from three very distinguished experts regarding terror financing. I'd like to welcome the ranking member, Mr. Higgins, and express my appreciation for the witnesses who are here today, and I now recognize myself for an opening statement. In 2005, the 9/11 Commission gave the U.S. government an A- in combating terrorist financing. As the U.S. built additional safeguards into the financial system to identify and disrupt the flow of funds to terrorists, we have scored some significant victories. Despite our successes, however, we cannot become complacent. Terrorist organizations have evolved, adopting new strategies and tactics, leveraging social media and encryption technology to recruit the next generation of jihadis and to plot attacks. Recent terror attacks and plotting have demonstrated that terrorist organizations can have global impact at very little cost. While the cost of financing the 9/11 attack was estimated at between $400,000 and $500,000, AQAP's 2010 cargo bomb plot reportedly cost only $4,200. The Japanese Paris attacks cost only $10,000, and the 2015 Charlie Hebdo attackers allegedly sold counterfeit sneakers and clothing to fund their activity. As we have hardened our defenses, our enemies have adapted as well, seeking to wear down our resolve with smaller scale, more frequent plots conducted by U.S. and European citizens who have fought on the battlefields of the Middle East and Asia or have become radicalized to take action at home. While ISIS's ability to hold territory in Iraq and Syria has provided it with access to resources that have allowed to finance its terror campaign internally, the success of coalition airstrikes targeting ISIS oil production has forced the group to seek revenue through other activities, including human trafficking, taxing the local population, and robbing antiquities from world-renowned cultural and historical sites. ISIS facilitators have also encouraged recruits to resort to petty crime to fund travel to Syria and homegrown violent extremism. The alleged head of the Brussels ring that conducted the Paris attacks doled out cash and presents to the wayward youths he recruited as thieves and prospective fighters. They were then trained to target train stations and tourists, stealing luggage, even shoplifting for their cause. I'm eager to hear from today's witnesses how terrorist groups and state sponsors of terrorism have been turning to criminal activities to develop new sources of funds, evade detection, and acquire logistical expertise, moving and laundering funds, as well as how supporters may be changing tactics to evade current laws to detect illicit funds moving to designated terror groups. Hezbollah facilitators have been shown to be particularly savvy in circumventing U.S. laws on terrorist financing. The Lebanese-Canadian bank case, where bank officers engaged in laundering money from Colombian drug cartels and mixing it with proceeds from used cars bought in the United States, illustrates the sophistication and motivation of Hezbollah to finance its terrorist operations and the close ties between terrorists and criminal networks. These organizations are highly innovative and motivated, and our government must remain nimble in the laws and authorities it provides to our intelligence and law enforcement agencies to meet this challenge. When examined over time, several fundamental lessons emerge. First, a wide range of terrorist organizations have sought to draw upon the wealth and resources of the United States to finance their organizations and activities. Second, just as there is no one type of terrorist, there is no one type of terrorist financier or facilitator. And third, terrorist financiers and facilitators are creative and will seek to exploit vulnerabilities in our society and financial system to further their unlawful aims. I'd like to welcome our expert panel. Your input is critical to the subcommittee's understanding of the current trends in terror financing and how the U.S. government can build stronger partnerships with the public and private sector to identify funds being diverted to terrorist organizations and disrupt and dismantle the criminal and money laundering wings. And now I am privileged to recognize the distinguished ranking member from upstate New York, almost Canada, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also look forward to hearing from the witnesses who have joined us today regarding your studies and background about this very, very important issue. Hearings like this allow us to stay engaged in the fight against terrorism, engage the dangers terrorist organizations pose in regions throughout the world. Terrorist organizations such as ISIS, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, to name a few, have all become very sophisticated in financing their terror activities. These financing tools span from criminal enterprises such as ransoms, drug operations, and human trafficking, to creating charities under false pretenses to, and what may be the most surprising of all, the looting and selling of antiquities to gain funds. Terror financing is of special interest to the committee because, according to reports in 2014 alone, ISIS attained revenue of $2 billion in a war chest of nearly $250 million. This surpasses any other terrorist organization's annual earnings and makes ISIS a financially self-sufficient organization. ISIS's second largest form of revenue is through the illicit and black market trade of stolen antiques. In control of a region that has over 5,000 archaeological sites, ISIS has destroyed or looted and stolen artifacts that are worth millions of dollars. In the Middle East and North African regions, ISIS has caused mass hysteria, wrecking temples in Syria, destroyed the Judeo-Christian tomb of Jonah, and pillaged the Mosul Museum in Iraq. Earlier this year, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization's Director General declared that the deliberate destruction of cultural heritage in Syria and Iraq is, in fact, a war crime. Finally, through the less prominent revenue source for ISIS, kidnapping for ransom has been effectively used by other terror organizations to finance their operations. Al-Qaeda and its affiliates have reportedly received in excess of $125 million through KFR since 2008, much of it paid by foreign governments. Combating these terror financing operations must be among our top priorities, as doing so is a key component to our efforts to counter these groups globally. I look forward to having a productive conversation with the panelists and hopefully learning more about how to halt these terror financing operations. With that, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and I would advise other members of the committee that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And we are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this vital topic. Our first witness will be Dr. Louise Shelley. She's the founder and director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason University. She's an internationally recognized expert on the relationship among terrorism, organized crime, and corruption. She's a published author on these vital topics and has received numerous awards and fellowships. She received her undergraduate cum laude from Cornell University and an MA in criminology from the University of Pennsylvania, and holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Shelley, you're recognized. Thank you for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Chairman King, Ranking Member Higgins, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me. I have submitted a statement, and so I will supplement it with some of the insights that I have had since I submitted it, and I also will highlight a few important points. The last few weeks, I have spent traveling in Europe, speaking with top specialists and advisors on terrorist finance and their homeland security. In fact, I joke that this is a life unlike what most academics have, especially American women academics. And from these conversations, I have a real concern that especially in Francophone Europe, where the attacks have occurred, that is in France and Belgium, there is not a real appreciation of the relationship of crime and terrorism, despite the fact that, as was mentioned in the opening statements, these terrorist attacks have been funded by petty crime. There is a failure to appreciate the importance of this. And what we are finding is that it is the same network that has been involved in all of these terrorist attacks that is dispersed among France, Belgium, the UK, and Germany, and maybe elsewhere. And they're heavily funded by crime, and these acts are committed primarily by radicalized criminals. And yet, there is not a strategy in Europe to deal with this problem. This is not just a problem for the Europeans, it is a problem for us, because we have Americans traveling in Europe, we have businesses operating internationally in Europe, we have military operations overseas, and yet we are having our allies failing to see this problem with the severity that it is and the consequences that it has and the types of policing and intelligence responses that one needs to this new hybrid threat. Secondly, my research that I continue to do under my Carnegie Corporation Fellowship points out the centrality of the problem of illicit trade to terrorist financing. This is a massive problem. It is 8 to 15% of the global economy, and therefore it is very possible to hide the illicit in the large-scale illicit flows. Yesterday, the research center that I direct had an event on the Panama Papers with the manager of the Panama Papers and the former head of the tax authority of Colombia, who provided detailed analyses of how much of this illicit money from Colombia, from the drug trade that is run by both criminals and terrorists, wound up in Panama using the mechanisms of trade-based money laundering and hiding illicit trade in larger scale trade. So this is a very clear example that we had yesterday of how this problem of trade-based money laundering is supporting terrorism, not just in the Middle East, but on our back door and paid for by the drug payments that come from the United States and move back to Colombia. So therefore, I think we need to pay much more attention to the role of illicit trade. And I'm glad that we're having a presentation on Antiquities on this panel, because that is one form of illicit trade that is used to fund terrorism and intersects with many other forms of illicit trade, as Ms. Laird and I discussed before the opening of the hearing. But this illicit trade does not exist in a vacuum. It is supported by banks, it is supported by law firms, it's supported by professional services that write contracts, that develop contracts, and help mask the illicit trade. And this is one thing that the Panama Papers has also revealed, is that there are a lot of high-level facilitators, and even though there are not many people mentioned in the Panama Papers that are American, many of the facilitators are based in the United States. And therefore, we need to be paying much more attention to the members of the legitimate community that are either inadvertently or sometimes knowingly facilitating illicit trade. We've seen this in recent revelations of Deutsche Bank, we've seen it with HSBC, and this continues to remain a problem. I also want to mention 3 foci areas of illicit trade that I think of as relatively new that are not being paid enough attention to. For example, there is now a large illicit trade in gold, some of this coming out of Colombia. And one of the things that we see with terrorist groups is they have enormous flexibility and ability to switch between one area of illicit activity and another. And so the revenues for the FARC in Colombia are now estimated to be greater from the illicit gold trade than from the narcotics trade. The second type of new trade I wanted to discuss is that of the kidney trade. For quite a number of years, there has been a trade in Egypt in which wealthy foreigners come and are operated on in hospitals, obtaining kidneys that they cannot legitimately obtain in the United States or Western Europe. Now there's a new source of providers of these kidneys, according to research with kidney donors and purchasers, is that migrants from the crisis in Iraq and Syria want to pay smugglers, but they don't have the money to pay the smugglers. So there are facilitators in Turkey working among the refugee communities that find individuals ready to sell their kidneys, who will then travel to Egypt, sell their kidneys, and pay the smugglers. What makes this a problem of terrorist finance is that it appears that this trade has become so lucrative that groups like al-Nusra are intimidating the doctors who have traditionally performed this trade and are taking many of the profits out of this trade. But what has changed is that the purchasers of the kidneys are no longer bringing suitcases of dollars to Egypt, but are putting the money through wire transfers to travel agencies into bank accounts in Western Europe, France, the UK, and Germany, which gives them a new funding source to draw on in Western banking centers that does not require transfers from the Middle East. The last area that I want to bring up as a new area of concern is what I call a problem of possibly dual-use crime, which is the growing trade of illicit pesticides, something that has really emerged on the international markets in the last 7-8 years. I was recently on this European trip at a meeting of the OECD on illicit trade, and one of the Polish specialists was talking about the confiscation of huge amounts of these dangerous pesticides in Northeast Europe. Europol is now estimating that 25% of the pesticides used in Northeastern Europe are illegal. The general figure is 10% in Europe, and it's about a third of the market in a major food exporter like India. It's also a problem in China. So we're looking at something that is both a health hazard, as we are an importer of food. We also have some of these illegal pesticides entering into our market, but not in as large a scale as elsewhere. But there's also a possibility that as this phenomenon increases, it can be used by terrorists to introduce dangerous chemicals and harm health. So this is something that I believe deserves more attention. So what do I recommend that we do? We're still not focusing sufficiently on illicit trade as a source of terrorist financing, despite the fact that trade is an essential element of the Middle East economy and is, as I just mentioned, has been revealed as being a central part of financing in the trade that we have in Colombia and Latin America. We need to focus on new emerging areas and not just the kinds of trade that we've been thinking about before. As I've talked about before, we need to be expanding our efforts in the United States to be focusing on the relationship of crime and terrorism and how these phenomena are linked. And in our attachés that work for Homeland Security, we need to be developing this greater appreciation of this phenomenon through our insights and lessons learned. And this needs to especially be done with our European colleagues who have faced such major terrorist challenges lately and have not yet reoriented their policing or their intelligence to focus on this threat in a new way. And because so much of this illicit trade is connected to the business world, we need to establish much more of public-private partnerships with companies that are aware of this illicit trade, with shipping countries, transport companies, and others. And much of this trade is going on in the dark web. There is research that is going on today on the internet, the deep web, and the dark web, but not enough that I think is accessible on the interaction of the crime and the terrorist funding that goes on between the dark web and the deep web. We had a seminar on this at our research center About 6 weeks ago, we had 120 people in the room, many of them from law enforcement, many of them that work in Homeland Security, and there's a desperate need for information and insights on how to understand and focus on this problem. And we must continue to address the money laundering that is contributing to the illicit trade and also deriving from the illicit trade. And we must work much more on the beneficial ownership between valuable properties, shell corporations, and understand the challenges we face in not having more transparency in our financial system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shelley. Our next witness is Dr. Jonathan Sansa. He's the Vice President for Research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He's been a leading scholar on terror finance and other counterterrorism issues for decades, serving in multiple think tanks as an analyst at the Department of Treasury. He earned his PhD from King's College in London and has published a number of books on terrorism and Middle East-based terror groups. Dr. Sansa, you're recognized. Thank you. Thank you for being here today.
Chairman King, Ranking Member Higgins, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, on behalf of Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you for inviting me to testify. As a former terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, I commend you for keeping an eye on this crucial aspect of our national security. I will focus my comments today on recent FDD research which tracked a U.S.-based network of former employees and donors from 3 domestic organizations that provided material and financial support to the terrorist organization Hamas, but who now work or fundraise for an Illinois-based organization called American Muslims for Palestine, or AMP. The 3 now defunct organizations are Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development, Kind Hearts for Charitable Development, and the Islamic Association for Palestine. Let's address Holy Land first. This is an organization that gave $12 million to Hamas over 10 years, and 5 of their leaders are now in jail in the United States. When I testified last month before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I discussed 3 AMP figures who had previously worked for or on behalf of the Holy Land Foundation. Today, I will discuss a 4th figure named Kifa Mustafa. Kifa Mustafa was the head of the Holy Land Foundation's office in Illinois. Today, he gives speeches at AMP fundraisers and makes promotional videos for the organization. Mr. Mustafa also works for the Mosque Foundation, a nonprofit that gave money to the Holy Land Foundation before it was shut down. Today, it gives money to AMP. Now let's look at the overlap with Kind Hearts. Abdul Basit Hamayel, who is officially the registered agent for AMP, was the Wisconsin and Illinois representative for Kind Hearts, a group that the Treasury called the progeny of the Holy Land Foundation. Treasury blocked the assets of Kind Hearts, and it was ultimately dissolved. Mr. Chairman, we have also learned that AMP's founder and president, Hatem Bazian, was one of 2 featured speakers at a 2004 Kind Hearts fundraising dinner in California. Incidentally, the other speaker at this dinner was Mohammed Al-Mazain, who is currently in jail for his role in the Holy Land Foundation and for providing financial support to Hamas. Bazian, I should note, also spoke in England at an event in 2014 sponsored by the Hamas charity known as Interpal, which was designated for terrorism by the U.S. Treasury in 2003. Interpal belonged to an umbrella organization known as Union of Good, which was also designated by the Treasury for terrorism in 2008. Finally, there are multiple connections between AMP and the Islamic Association for Palestine, or IAP. This was a group found civilly liable in federal court for supporting Hamas. One interesting figure here is Osama Abu Ershad, who ran IAP's newspaper. He is currently the National Coordinator and Policy Director for AMP. In late April, Abu Ershad took what he called a surprise trip to Doha, Qatar, where he posted pictures of himself on social media with Ayman Jarwan. Jarwan was imprisoned in the United States and ultimately deported for his role in a fraudulent charity that violated Iraq sanctions, laundered money, and sent funds to 2 charities designated for funding al-Qaeda. The exact nature of this meeting between Jarwan and Abu Ershad is unclear. My written testimony today, along with the one I submitted to Congress last month, describes AMP's other troubling connections to now defunct organizations implicated in terrorism finance. I encourage you to read them both. And when you do, please note how AMP operates on university campuses across the country by coordinating and funding the efforts of an activist network known as Students for Justice in Palestine. To conclude, our open source research did not indicate that AMP or any of these individuals are currently involved in any illegal activity. However, because they are a tax-advantaged organization, the past activities of those who work for on behalf of AMP should at least merit greater transparency and scrutiny. The IRS might consider studying the British model for charity oversight. In the UK, the Charity Commission monitors the charitable sector for organizations that are run by extremists. This has not stopped individuals from exercising their right to free speech according to the laws of their country, but the Commission has ensured in the most egregious abuses of the system that they don't receive tax breaks. The goal, according to the Commission's website, is to, quote, ensure that the public can support charities with confidence, end quote. Finally, there is a broader question, one raised today by Eli Lake of Bloomberg News, and that is the Treasury Department still tracking individuals previously involved in terror financing activities here in the United States? If so, this subcommittee has a power to ask why, who should be leading this effort, and whether more resources should be devoted to the problem. Once again, on behalf of Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you for inviting me to testify. I look forward to your questions about this network and other terrorism finance trends that FDD has been tracking.
Thank you, Doctor, very much for your testimony. Our next witness is Deborah Laird. She's the chairman of the Antiquities Coalition, an organization which she launched to work with governments across the Middle East to fight against antiquities trafficking and its use in financing terrorism. She's also CEO and founding partner of Basilina. Did I pronounce that correctly? Okay. A strategic consulting firm focused on China and the Middle East. She serves as a senior fellow at the Paulson Institute, a not-for-profit chaired by former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. Ms. Laird also serves on a number of prestigious board and advisory councils, including National Geographic and the board of the Archaeological Institute of America. Ms. Laird, thank you for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. You're recognized.
Great. Thank you, Chairman King, Ranking Member Higgins. We really appreciate the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee this morning. The Antiquities Coalition commends the subcommittee for its focus on the cutting off of financing for terrorist organizations, particularly for antiquities trafficking. Culture has very clearly become a weapon of war and a fundraising tool for violent extremist organizations across the Middle East and Northern Africa. Certainly, antiquities looting has been happening ever since there was buried treasure, but not since World War II has it happened on this scale. Millions of archaeological sites, historic and religious sites, are being threatened by organized plunder by ISIL. These attacks are more than a destruction of heritage. They are the eradication of a shared history, the elimination of economic opportunity. They are a crime of war. They're precursors to genocide, and they fund terrorism. The Abu Sayyaf raid by U.S. Special Forces confirmed how the extremist group has institutionalized the trafficking and destruction of antiquities. It's created its own Ministry of Antiquities, and it uses the sales of permits to promote antiquities looting and illicit excavations. ISIL's making significant profits from this. Our records that were seized show that in just a 3-month period, they had raised $1.25 million, or annualized $5 million. While not on the scale of oil revenues, as was indicated by the ranking member earlier, if you think about what the costs are to fund some of these terrorist activities, that money goes a really long way. Particularly when you think there is a virtual limitless supply of these antiquities across the MENA region. ISIL views these priceless antiquities as just a commodity to be plucked from the ground for profit. The organized looting and trafficking of antiquities, or as we call it, cultural racketeering, is a criminal industry that spans the globe. All countries with a past worth protecting are now at risk, but countries in crisis are most vulnerable, particularly during times of war. Nowhere has heritage suffered more than in Syria and Iraq. The list of destruction and plundering is long: Palmyra, the Mosul Museum, Nineveh, and hundreds of others, including historical sites that are meaningful to the foundations of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And what is the size of this illegal trade? It's very difficult to determine the size of the legitimate antiquities market, let alone the illicit. But my organization has sponsored research by the University of Chicago to calculate, for the first time ever, the size of the losses in Iraq and Syria through algorithms that could be applied for other countries. And we had commissioned Dr. Sarah Parkek, who was this year's TED Prize winner, to do the same in Egypt, where she calculated that over a 3-year period, the losses were potentially as high as $3 billion. Yet, what we do know are what are the declared trade figures of imports into the United States of HES Tariff Line 97, which is for antiques over 100 years old. The U.S. accounts for 43% of the global art market. We're the largest in the world. And last year, our #1 import from Syria, accounting for 40% of our total imports, were antiquities. Even though overall imports from Syria have dropped precipitously from $430 million in 2010 to $12.4 million last year, the rate of antiquities has continued to increase. Rate of antiquities imports has continued to increase. And all of these antiquities came through one port, the customs port of New York. For Iraq, after oil, antiquities are the largest import from that country. Since the Arab Spring in 2011, we have seen from 5 countries in the MENA area an average increase overall in antiquities of 90%. For Turkey, it's been up by 80%, Egypt 55%, Syria 134%, Iraq 492%, and Lebanon 58%. Why Turkey and Lebanon? Because they're the major transshipment points for antiquities coming out of Iraq and Syria. So there's much that can be done. In April, the Antiquities Coalition released a task force report with recommendations that promote very practical solutions to this growing crisis and to serve as an ongoing resource for policymakers. It was recommendations for the U.S. government, international institutions, and the art market, and just one in a series of reports that we hope to release, particularly the next one focused on what source countries can do. In addition, we fully support the recommendations in H.R. 2285, focused on ICE and CBP. These organizations are on the front line of our war against cultural racketeering and protecting our own market. But other considerations for the subcommittee to think about. One is there needs to be an overall coordinator within the United States government. And we believe that that person should be at the National Security Council, that they should be able to coordinate through all the institutions of the U.S. government and work with subcommittees like this one. And the focus of law enforcement should be on criminal prosecutions, not just on seizing the antiquities and repatriating them. And the trade should be restricted to designated ports. This has been done in the case of wildlife. There's no reason it can't be done in the case of antiquities. And one of the things that the earlier legislation promotes and we strongly support is as the majority of antiquities are coming in through New York, there's a big difference between the quality of the seizures that are happening in Newark, which has done a tremendous amount of work, and the authorities there are highly trained, and JFK. And we think an additional focus on just some practical aspects of training at JFK could go a long way towards stopping the U.S. becoming the principal designation, particularly since most of the art market is based in New York City. Raising awareness at ports of entry, just having Border Patrol work at various ports of entry to recognize that the import of these antiquities is illegal. And the Department of Homeland Security could be supportive of what we hope will be a more active role in the State Department in negotiating cultural MOUs with countries in crisis. These cultural MOUs serve as the legal basis to give ICE the ability to close the market to antiquities coming into our country. There is not a single one of them with any country in the Middle East at the moment. The legislation that was passed recently that stops the import of antiquities into Syria builds on what was done with Iraq, but both of those have been legislated. We need to see them with Egypt, with some of the transshipment countries and others to really help protect our own market from being a source of terrorist financing. It's important we stop American dollars from funding conflict and crime through cultural racketeering. This is a problem that didn't start with ISIL, and it's not going to end with it. So it's necessary to create a framework for combating the illicit trade in antiquities globally. I thank the subcommittee for your work, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Laird, and thank all of you for appearing today. Just so you'll know, all of your written statements will be submitted for the record. I recognize myself. Dr. Shelley, in your testimony, you make a reference to the NYPD and the Los Angeles Police Department, the success they've had in disrupting terror activities and how that could be applied to other law enforcement. But do you have anything specifically you want to say in there that other departments should be looking at that is being done by New York and Los Angeles?
I think one of the successes that explains, or one of the reasons that explains their successes is the ability to help organize the diverse federal agencies that are working in these locales and to cooperate with local law enforcement. So that's one very important part, that there needs to be much more local federal cooperation. Secondly, New York has very top analysts on counterterrorism with wide experience that are helping their intelligence and their analytical community. So they're doing things that are site-specific, just as Ms. Laird was talking about the particularities of the New York market. There are things that you need to focus on and understand vulnerabilities in your community. And also, there is an importance of coordinating the counterterrorism policing and the counter-crime policing, because these two intersect in many ways that are not high-level transnational crime. So it becomes very much the activities of local police that help detect something that could be overlooked by federal law enforcement, but the two of them informing each other makes for much more successful policing.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Sansa, you mentioned in your written testimony that the Treasury Department has not made a domestic designation of a charity for supporting terrorism for 2009. Now, does that mean that illegal fundraising has stopped, or has there been a shift in U.S. policy? And any comment you can make on that, I appreciate it.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. In short, the reason for this halt is still unclear. I think on the one hand, we can certainly say that the environment has become a restrictive one for charities that would like to fundraise on American soil. The successes that we've had, certainly since the first few years after 9/11, may have served as a deterrent for those who would want to fundraise for terrorists on American soil. On the other hand, I find it very hard to believe that there is not one single charity operating here in the United States and actively fundraising for a terrorist organization, whether it be Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, or the Islamic State. And so I do wonder whether this is a political decision that has been made by the White House, whether it has been a bureaucratic one made by the Treasury Department as the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence has shifted its priorities. And so it may be that the FBI is focused on this squarely. The issue that I would raise, though, is whether the FBI has enough manpower and has enough at its disposal in order to counter this challenge. In other words, we know that the FBI is squarely focused on trying to defend the homeland day in and day out, that they're looking at threats from ISIS or from lone wolf terrorists or from Al-Qaeda, and they may be less inclined to go after some of what they might deem as small fries, smaller charities that are fundraising for organizations that may not pose a direct threat to the homeland. So I think there's some interesting bureaucratic questions to ask the federal government right now, to ask the White House, and it could be the function of this subcommittee to do so.
Thank you. You've also mentioned a connection between the U.S.-based BDS movement and the PLO. Anything you could add to that?
Absolutely. The research that we submitted to the House Foreign Affairs Committee 3 weeks ago indicated that there is an unregistered charity operating in the Chicago area, which is also where this other charity, AMP, is operating right now, and that this smaller charity, this unregistered charity, has been, that one of its members, one of its leaders, has been a fighter for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, has a function within the PLO as one of their notaries in the Chicago area, and also members of this organization have gone to meet with Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman and president of the Palestinian Authority, as well as his prime minister, Rami Hamdallah. The extent to which the PLO may or may not be funding the BDS movement, we just don't know at this point, but certainly that node that we found in Chicago may offer some indication.
Thank you. I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just on the issue of ransoms, the United States and Britain has an explicit policy not to pay ransoms. My question is, do they do that? Do they pay ransoms through proxies? Dr. Shelley, any thoughts on that?
I think that there's a decline in the kidnapping of Americans because there's less likelihood of paying ransoms. I'm afraid that in some cases, some people may use proxies, but I have no definitive proof of that.
But if the other European countries beyond Great Britain have a policy of paying ransoms, and the incidences of hostage taking disproportionately from folks from those countries, are those European countries now reconsidering their policies of paying ransom?
I have not heard that there is a major reconsideration of this. This is part of the problem of what I was discussing earlier, of the Europeans failing to connect the dots between the crime problem and the terrorism problem and the money that funds terrorism.
What's that? Yes, please.
Just a quick note, Mr. Ranking Member, that I think that there is a maybe an interesting angle to look at when we talk about proxies or cutouts involved in ransom. I look at the case of Bo Bergdahl as being extremely instructive, that the Qataris served as an intermediary on behalf of the Taliban to secure the release of Bo Bergdahl in exchange for other Guantanamo Bay prisoners. And this is something that the Qataris have been doing. This is an interesting country that is, at the one hand, it is an ally of the United States. On the other hand, it is working on behalf of some of our enemies. And so it would be instructive to take a look at the case of Qatar in the role of kidnapping and the release of people who've been held hostage.
So are you arguing that a prisoner exchange would constitute a paying of ransom in a way?
Certainly.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Okay. Just the other issue, generally with respect to ISIS, and what is the current trend in terms of where their financing is coming from the largest component to the smallest component? Has that changed at all for all the panelists?
There has been certainly a diminution in the amount of money obtained from oil, but there has been an increase in the amount of money obtained from forcing refugees so that their property is being confiscated. There has been a taxing of the migrant flows. There has been a movement into taxing the captagon and the drugs that move within the Middle East, especially to Saudi Arabia, so that there are other areas of growth that have compensated for this. What is very interesting is that there is a very different basis of funding for ISIS in the Middle East than ISIS in Europe. Almost all of ISIS in Europe is locally crime-funded from small-scale petty crimes. There have been, as I mentioned in my testimony, very few examples of financial transfers from the Middle East to fund the terrorism attacks or the travel of terrorists to the Middle East. So we're looking at two very different funding sources for European-based terrorism versus Middle East terrorism.
Mr. Ranking Member, we had Assistant Secretary Danny Glazer from the Treasury Department at FDD yesterday and gave a very interesting presentation, and he did mention that we've seen a precipitous decline in ISIS finance, which we certainly welcome as good news. I think some of that has to do with the simple fact that the price of oil has dropped since ISIS's formation. Also, we've seen the bombing of cash depots, which has certainly dealt a blow to the organization. But I would note that the primary source of funding from my perspective for ISIS has been through taxing, plunder, and pillaging. And so what this means is that the ability of ISIS to raise funds for itself is inextricably tied to the territory that it controls. And so when one talks about defeating ISIS finance, a lot of the time we hear in the U.S. government that we can sort of separate out the battle against the flow of finance from the overall battle of trying to degrade or defeat ISIL, as the administration calls it. I actually see that it is one and the same, that if we're able to deprive them of this territory, then we'll be able to deprive them of the ability to tax their own people or to plunder the territory that they've captured. And so this is an incredibly important issue to note as we talk about a strategy for ISIL moving forward.
My time is up. Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent that this report from the Antiquities Coalition be submitted for the record.
Absolutely. Yeah, without objection. Okay. The gentleman from New York, the chairman of the Transportation Security Subcommittee, Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Laird, I want to focus some of my questions on you for a moment, if I may. I don't think you can underestimate the importance of the antiquities black market. Before I came to Congress, I was a federal prosecutor, and remarkably, we had one such case in our district in Syracuse, New York. And it happened because we found thousands upon thousands of tablets that had ended up at Cornell University. And they ended up there through a antiquities dealer in New York City. And going through that case, it was remarkable to me to see how difficult it was to do any sort of a criminal prosecution, and how difficult it was just to go through the process of repatriating these assets back to Iraq. There was, the tablets were stolen. They're all small tablets, about 4,000 years old, that really chronicled Iraq's history. And I don't know how you put a value on that, but I know that this dealer in New York City paid a substantial amount of money to get those. He kept some there, and some were donated to Cornell. They all ultimately went back. But, you know, so I want to talk more about that, because I think, you know, what ISIS has done in Palmyra and these other places, we don't know what they've done with those antiquities. But I do know there's a voracious appetite for them on the international market. So with that in mind, and that as a backdrop, I want to ask you a couple of questions. What can we do to tweak the laws from a criminal standpoint to try and use these, to better prosecute and better investigate and prosecute these antiquities laws? And also, I want to probe with you after that a little bit more about why you think it's necessary to have someone on the National Security Council involved in this, as opposed to the Department of Justice.
Well, thank you for raising, I think, what are some of the critical issues, because it is very hard to try these cases. I think there are several different reasons for it. One, there is a lack of understanding sometimes about the antiquities issues, and they aren't seen as a priority, even though it is one of the top global crimes. There aren't dedicated resources at the Department of Justice or dedicated prosecutors like there are now in wildlife, that if you even had one dedicated antiquities prosecutor at DOJ, who local prosecutors could call.
See, that was my thought. I'm like wondering, somebody from the Department of Justice that became a specialist in this and really understood it.
Right.
Once you understand the law, it's really not that hard to make a case like any other case. Garnering the proof is the thing, but I think having someone at the Department of Justice specifically designated for that is probably a pretty good idea.
That's right, and just a month ago, it was Antiquities Week in New York, Asia Week, sorry. And dealers from around the world came to sell antiquities there. Every single day, for 10 days, there were raids on antiquities dealers and on auction houses. Not a single person is going to jail. Some poor old Japanese man dealer was caught, and he went to Rikers for 1 week, and then he got a deal and went back, and they seized his antiquity, and that was the worst that happened. So it really is an issue. And so all that work takes place. And these are being sold for millions and millions of dollars. They raised over, I think, close to $400 million in that time, and there are no prosecutions. So,
right. You think about the $400 million, like Mr. King noted earlier, the Paris attacks were, what, $10,000 total?
Yeah.
So you can do a lot of damage with $400 million.
Exactly.
Right.
And the reason I said the National Security Council, and maybe I'm biased because I used to work there, but there needs to be coordination overall in the government. Currently, the top position in the U.S. government is an assistant secretary in culture and diplomacy at the State Department. And when we're dealing with terrorist issues and financing and many of these others, I just don't think as capable as obviously they are there, that's the right seat. And looking at cultural diplomacy, there needs to be somebody who's centralized, who can coordinate with DOJ, with ICE, with others, with Treasury, to make sure that we're collecting the kind of information that we need and these things are being investigated.
Yeah.
The other point, just if I could say one
Sure.
last thing on the art market, it's largely unregulated. And so in many ways for these auction houses, who I think Christie's makes about $7 billion annually, Sotheby's makes very similar, in many ways these seizures are just the price of doing business. And
Right.
so it's not necessarily in their interest to do the kind of due diligence that we would expect to see to track it back to terrorists.
Now, when you say Sotheby's makes $7 billion a year or around there, is that just commissions they earn on the things they're selling?
Yeah,
Okay, so obviously,
those are their annual revenues.
the amount of revenue they're generating through those sales is exponentially more than that, obviously, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think that I'm trying to think of the best legal means. Do you have any suggestions as to what the best legal means would be to create this position or positions at the Department of Justice? Because I think it's something that needs to be done.
That's wonderful. I think there could be a precedent with what has been done with wildlife. And they've appointed somebody who's a top prosecutor, I understand, who comes with a background in wildlife crimes. There is an arts crime unit at the FBI, but they're not investigators. And so I think really the position needs to be a DOJ with somebody with a criminal prosecution background.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. My time has pretty much expired, so thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Katko. And the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating. Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might comment that I'm just days back from traveling through northern Africa in particular, and I must tell you that our efforts at striking and targeting oil reserves and the revenues they're getting from there is really been effective and is being extended, actually, because of its effectiveness. So I've seen how we've been successful in that regard. I also am aware that, in Syria and Iraq, how the area is shrinking, and that will affect taxation. But we're going to see more of an emphasis because of this effectiveness, I think, on ransoming and on antiquities and trailings because of the way we're shrinking the other alternatives, I believe. And so I want to thank Ms. Laird for the work that you've done with the Culture Under Threat Task Force and the Antiquities Coalition. It's important work in many respects, but I'd ask her to talk about what we can do to have more bilateral agreements with other countries, because again, as we begin, and we have a lot of work still to do, as we begin putting up barriers here, they'll seek other venues. So how can we work, in your opinion, to extend those agreements?
Great, thank you also for the excellent work that you're doing, and we're very supportive of the legislation that you're proposing. These cultural MOUs are really very important because they do provide the legal basis to stop the import of antiquities into our country, and we've approached it in two ways. One, to encourage the State Department, well, three, encourage the State Department to look at these as part of their diplomatic efforts in the Middle East. Two, to work with the countries in question to help them understand what they can be doing, because it's not just the U.S., it's all the major markets that we can do this with. And three, we're talking to the Arab League to get them to consider requesting an MOU on behalf of all of its members so that we could do it at once. The United States is the leader on this issue, and if we proceed with this, we will see very quickly that the Europeans will do something similar. And so if we can close our market, we can use these agreements to close the European market and the Japanese market, we at least have made a major step forward in cutting off those sources, which are the largest markets. The only other one out there, which is the second largest market, is China, and we have to start to think about how to work with them, because soon, if they decide they want to start buying these antiquities, that's going to be a big problem.
And I do think we're going to have to look at Northern Africa as well, because they're sourcing that as they're getting more pressure in Syria and Iraq as well. Just another question that I had in terms of the way the organizations, the terrorist organizations, are trying to deal monetarily with things. The Society of the Worldwide International Financial Telecommunications, the SWIFT. I wanted to see, there's a little tension, as you might have known, with our EU allies in terms of privacy issues in dealing with that. If we're changing that to adapt to their concerns too, how can that limit our effectiveness? So could you comment on what's going on, our privacy concerns of our allies in Europe, and how that's affecting our ability to deal with it from a financial standpoint?
Mr. Keating, I'm happy to answer that from maybe one or two angles. As you are likely aware, at one point the U.S. Treasury was mining the SWIFT database through a subpoena system. This is now made public, but this was something that was it first made news when I was at the Treasury Department, that the Treasury was issuing subpoenas to the SWIFT system, and then they were able to look at the actual data that was being transferred by suspected terrorists. I am unclear as to whether that continues to this day, and it may have something to do with these specific concerns that our European allies have voiced over this. We have also seen SWIFT at the center of a controversy with regard to Iran. The SWIFT consortium had agreed to block the Iranians from the SWIFT system, making it virtually impossible for 17 different Iranian banks to move money electronically around the world, and this was an incredibly effective method to halt terror finance coming out of Iran. And we, pursuant to the deal just signed over last summer, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, we have now allowed Iran back onto this system. And so this is going to make the countering of Iranian terrorism finance that much more difficult. And so my sense here is that we have, I think, growing disagreements over the financial data that can be used by the U.S. government to counter terrorism finance coming from SWIFT. I don't know how they plan on moving forward with their cooperation with the U.S., but my sense is that it's a steady backslide, and perhaps engaging with the SWIFT consortium on a one-to-one basis could be very useful.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, if I could just have unanimous consent to indicate I'll have a written question on the matter of virtual currency, and because, as we know, the terrorists in the Paris attack the night before paid for their hotel with prepaid, type of currency, if you want to call it currency. And so that's another issue we're going to have to look at carefully. So I'll do that in writing, Mr. Chairman, so I don't extend my time here, and I yield back.
Without objection. The gentleman from Massachusetts always gets what he wants anyway, so I can do it. A gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hurd, the chairman of the Information Technology Subcommittee. Mr. Hurd.
Can I say something on that?
Oh, surely.
I'd say that one of the topics I heard discussed extensively at the meetings I was at in Europe among Europeans was the issue of how much the prepaid credit cards, the SWIFT, are held by corporations, and yet it's governments that are trying to combat the terrorism. And this is forcing a lot of consideration of this issue in Europe. I think, and this is why I was pointing out in my testimony, that I think the Europeans, as they're facing this issue of the evidence of the linkage between crime and terrorism, with just the example that you gave, are doing a serious thinking, and as they're worrying that they're not doing enough to prevent the next terrorist attack, I think there's an area of flexibility and engagement that is open now that was not open previously.
Thank you. Mr. Hurd.
Chairman King, Ranking Member Higgins, I want to thank you all for this, putting on this hearing. It's one of the more illuminating hearings I've been to this year. And my first question is to Ms. Laird. You mentioned that organized plunder by ISIS, you said it's generating $1 million a year or $5 million a year?
In the raid on the Abu Sayyaf compound by our special forces, and he was essentially the CFO, they set up a Ministry of Antiquities, and they were selling permits to promote digging, as well as they take taxes, and we have an infograph we submitted into the record to show the process. Receipts for 3 months were $1.5 million.
Wow, okay, that's helpful. Can you mention or answer briefly, what is UNESCO's role in all of this?
UNESCO's responsibility is obviously over culture. They have raised awareness significantly and highlighted the linkages between cultural genocide as a precursor to genocide and promoting this as a crime of war under the Hague Convention. Their actual ability to go in and help protect sites and other activities like that is very limited. I think that that's an opportunity, if the U.S. were to consider participation again in UNESCO, to really take a leadership role.
Thank you. Terrorists are becoming increasingly tech savvy. There's evidence that cyber attacks and cyber theft are becoming tools in their arsenal. And Dr. Shanzer, this may be most appropriate for you. Are there any instances that you know where terrorist group have engaged in ransomware? Are they trying to take people's data and hold it hostage for a reward? And Dr. Shelley, if you have any input on that.
Congressman Hurd, I've actually not seen anything specifically related to that. What we have seen is what we call cyber-enabled economic warfare, which is, I would say, is a growing trend where state sponsors of terrorism are trying to capture that information and perhaps use it for political means. And I don't know if you can call it terrorism per se, but certainly the capturing of the SF-86 information of U.S. government officials by what we believe is the Chinese certainly qualifies as cyber-enabled economic warfare to my mind. The hack of Sony by North Korean hackers, this also, I think, qualifies. It's a new realm. I think it's more difficult to characterize, but certainly something to watch.
Thank you. And I think I would, that's an area that we need to explore a little bit more. And one point to Ms. Laird, one of the other values of having someone sitting at NSC on this is to drive collection within the intelligence community. I spent 9.5 years as an undercover officer in the CIA, and I was chasing Hawala deers and folks like that to try to understand, to follow the money and collect that. And if I would have had some of this information on some of these folks that are organized in illegal antiquities dealing, those guys are probably a less covert than Al Qaeda, and I think that's another value of having an entity within the NSC to ensure this is part of the NIPIF, the National Intelligence Priority Framework, to drive collection in order to stop this funding stream to terrorists. And my last question is probably best directed to Dr. Shelley. Many of our Gulf partners, we're seeing money coming from the Gulf into organizations in Syria and Iraq. What can be done to help our Gulf partners solve this problem that's happening within their own borders?
That's a very difficult question. In part, some of our Gulf partners have to be aware that this money is being moved and are consciously not doing something about it. So this is a problem. So I can't say that there's government complicity, but there's also not an attempt to suppress it. And I think part of what I've said in my testimony is that much more needs to be explained about the linkages between the crime, the money movement, and the terrorism, and how it comes back to bite you. And that's something that many people don't understand. And I think the Saudis are beginning to understand this much better, but there are other parts of the Gulf that need to be helped along in this area as well.
And on that, the Deputy Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is leading a coalition of 39 Islamic countries that are focusing on the narrative, encountering the narrative of extremism. And I think this is a topic that can be integrated into their efforts. And the fact that it's being led by our Sunni partners is important. But this is an area where we can support them.
It's also very interesting that within the context of the United Nations, the Saudis are being very involved in looking at the crime-terror linkage as well, and trying to bring other countries to be aware of this.
I really appreciate you all being here today, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hurd. Gentleman yields back. Ranking Member, do you have any further questions? Thank you. So I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony today. It's been extremely valuable. I want to thank the members for their questions. And the members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions to the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing if you would. We'd appreciate it. So pursuant to Committee Rule 7E, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. And without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.